it was really important to have events on a weekly basis so that we could test our hypothesis of a system we just built and then rapidly change it. And, we did that first virtual Burning Man 4 months after our first line of code. And it was a mad scramble to build things. But we'd never had an event with tens of thousands of people in it until that first Burning Man. And we learned a ton during that. We were changing things, even every day, every night we were scrambling to improve things. So I think it's really critical to build in public. A lot of folks are afraid that somebody's going to steal their idea if they try to launch too early, or if they build publicly, or if they tell everybody what they're doing. The reality is, once you have any modicum of success, everybody's going to chase after that anyways.
Right,
so,
right.
I think the fear of building in public is a little bit overblown.
All right, Daniel, thanks for joining me on Tech Scenes Unplugged. You're the CEO and founder of Topia.
That I am. Thanks for having me, Jeff. Excited to be here.
Well, let's start from the top. Give me and everybody else like a high-level overview of Topia. What are you guys about, and what are you guys working on?
What are we about? So Topia is, we like to say that we're spatial communication technology. Really what we're doing is we're making it so that the kinds of social interactions and social experiences that you can have in person, we're breaking down the geographic constraints and the need to actually always be in person to have those social experiences. And instead, now you can do them online, right? And so essentially, we have these virtual worlds that are browser-based, super accessible. You have an avatar that's your embodiment within this world, and you move the avatar around and you connect over encrypted video chat to any other avatars that are in your proximity. So you can have 100 or thousands of people in the same space, and you're forming small group conversations, moving between conversations. You have the agency, just like you do in real life, to walk away from a conversation that you don't want to be in anymore. And then the world itself has a lot of interaction. You can embed curriculum. You can integrate third-party systems with an SDK and an API, which are basically a set of developer tools that allow any kind of content, curriculum, systems to be integrated into the worlds themselves. And so not only do you have these social experiences, but you have the context around you as well.
Now, you've been making, I think you put it this way, the internet more human. Is that right? You spent probably over a decade doing that. What was the intersection of Topia, your experience with, making the internet human, and the market coming together at the right time?
Well, I've been sort of obsessed with the idea of making the internet more real time, right? And so I discovered a technology called WebRTC, which is Web Real-Time Communication. It's a protocol that Google has been building for about a decade. And so in the early 2010s, I started building with that technology, and I had a startup that was about fitness, right? Real-time fitness experiences where you could see and interact with your instructor, with other people taking a class online from wherever you were in the world. And, what really happened is my plan for the 2020s was to build this out as a much more immersive social experience engine. And I started building in VR. And when the pandemic hit, I threw out the VR technology because nobody really has headsets. That hardware just isn't really ready. It's not accessible. Restarted browser-based, simple worlds, 2.5 dimensional, not really gaming orient, too heavy on the gaming side. And the reason was that at the beginning of the pandemic, everybody really needed a way to connect with their communities. And so we were doing tons of events. We held virtual Burning Man, for example. We were one of the official Burning Man platforms for 2 years. And we had hundreds of events. We had millions of minutes of people connecting with each other in the platform. And as the pandemic was coming to an end, we realized that one-off events were also coming to an end, right? Anybody listening to this probably went to a bunch of online events during the pandemic. In the last 2 years, probably haven't been to many. And so what we're doing now is more of the persistently available spaces for specific use cases, specifically in education. We're doing a lot around K-12 and in higher ed, and providing the real-time community engine to help kids and adult learners have a sense of belonging within their broader community, and bringing different stakeholders together, bringing alumni together, job fairs, those kinds of things are really what we're focused on now.
So the pandemic kind of allowed you to jump into this, but from that jump in point, you kind of found different opportunities and different areas where that encrypted platform would be really useful and helpful.
Yeah, my plan was to really launch a platform around this in like 2028. And the pandemic accelerated everything, and I realized I didn't have 8 years to build this slowly in the background as sort of a collaborative, immersive experience engine. And now was the time. Everybody was focused on it. So it sort of forced my hand, and it did give us a lot of usage. It allows us to develop a lot of IP and underlying technology, and the whole system that powers Topia. So it was a boon from that perspective, but it was also kind of like a red flag or a false flag in some ways, right? The whole metaverse hype, Facebook changing their name to Meta, all of that kind of chaos that happened, put a lot of attention on the industry, and I think set a lot of false expectations. You had platforms that were being valued. I won't name names, but there was a platform that was an events platform that was valued at $10 billion during the pandemic, and then sold itself for parts for $15 million, just a year ago. That kind of shows you, the exuberance that was happening.
Yeah, it sped it up, but then it kind of slowed it down again a little bit, in essence, right? And what you guys have done, and I think what's interesting, what I really like, what you've done is you already saw where these other opportunities could be. You took advantage of that people needed to get together, but having a highly encrypted private network, which I believe is what you guys are doing with specifically for companies to have that on their own, I think is really valuable versus probably sitting on top of other platforms that are not so encrypted, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, our team is mostly engineering and product. We're pretty deep tech. A lot of other quasi competitors or competitors that existed, as you mentioned, just built themselves on top of Twilio or TalkBox or some other system, and they leverage all that. For us, we really focused hard for years on building our peer-to-peer WebRTC mesh networks. And that allows us basically to create these encrypted tunnels between client devices. And we can do that dynamically. So as people are moving around a space, we're connecting and disconnecting, and we can do it as a mesh. So we can have 10 people connected. It feels like you're in a group, but really it's just peer-to-peer encrypted connections between each other. And what we've done now is actually make that available as a social connectivity engine. We do private label deployments. So people, you can go to topia.io. That's kind of like our consumer sandbox or playground. But our real enterprise offering is that we actually roll the entire application suite and all of our networking technology into private label deployments where our customers own their servers, own their database. It runs on their domain. All the branding and typography, the user accounts, it's all integrated into their existing systems. And they get all of this peer-to-peer WebRTC networking, which allows them to, just to give you an example, right? One of our customers, they went from 200,000 minutes a month to 1 million minutes a month in the platform, and there was no additional cost, right? That's what our peer-to-peer WebRTC technology enables. So it's not just private communications. It's also extremely scalable at basically no cost. And, we're building other systems on top of that, and our customers can also leverage that to build all sorts of really interesting functionality on top. And so, we're kind of like a platform as a service now.
Right. And what's interesting, what I think is important, is the fact that in highly regulated industries where this information is private, right? I think it's so important to have a tunnel like that and a network like that that's private. I would assume, if you were using Meta or other platforms, that information would be used in different ways.
It's interesting. The more immersive things become, the more data is generated, and the more immersive the conversations are. Especially when you talk about synchronous communication versus asynchronous, asynchronous comms. In asynchronicity, you have time to really carefully think about it, exactly what you're putting out into the world, or sending to somebody specifically. With synchronous communication, it's more like this, right? It's more like how we actually evolved to be in conversation, and it's more fluid, it's more dynamic. People say things they don't necessarily intend to say or reveal, and when you talk about even like VR headsets, right, that kind of immersion, the companies will be able to see where your eyeballs are looking. They'll be able to put ads right in front of your field of view. There's no looking away for that. So, when you think about some of these big tech companies and synchronous communication using a big tech company, they're getting a lot of data, and they're using that data, and it's expensive also, right? Server-based communication is quite expensive. We're basically serverless communication, but server-based is expensive. They get a lot more data and information on everything you're saying, and they can use that data to serve you more targeted ads that are more valuable, which they need to do because they're paying for the server-based communication. And in our system, we don't have any of those traps.
That makes a lot of sense. So one of the questions I have for you, and I think it's really interesting, you guys are venture-backed. You definitely took a different route that I see a lot of venture-backed companies do, right? Usually they hit the ground running, it's growth, 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 growth. You guys had the growth, but you've been really focused on building tech and building it for the long run, and made a large investment in that, not only time, but capital. And how did you balance that with your investors?
We're fortunate to have wonderful investors, and they're helpful in how we think about growth, and we've grown a lot. But they also give us the freedom to invest in the technology and run the company the way that we think makes sense, right? We think of ourselves as building really like the infrastructure layer of the future of the internet, and there's a lot of different ways that can play out. We look to even folks like Red Hat as a shining example, right? There's a lot of examples of tremendous success in the open internet, in companies that have built incredible technology and then given it to the world and are able to generate a lot of revenue along the way. And that's essentially what our platform is going towards in the future. So, it's the key with raising venture is to raise from folks that have similar perspective and mentality around your company and your prospects. And we're fortunate to find ourselves just with great partners.
Yeah, that's awesome. And how do you envision, so what you've built now, and how do you envision that connecting to the future of the internet? What's that look like to you?
There's a lot of different ways it could play out, but we just as an example, right? We're partnered with AWS, and so providing this as a service layer on top of existing servers, where anybody can build whatever they imagine on top, whether that is social experiences, it could actually be games, and even the line between social media or social experiences and communication technologies and games in the future sort of start blending all together as we get into more virtual and immersive kinds of experiences. There's also things like Neuralink, right? The Vision Pro, which is a spatial compute device that just came out from Apple. There you have basically augmented reality or mixed reality on top of the physical world. As you're moving around and you're connecting with objects in the world and with other people, you're either sending all of those communications and those connections and everything you're doing through a server-based system or through a peer-to-peer based system, right? And so we don't necessarily have like a stranglehold on peer-to-peer or anything like that, but we are champions of the value of peer-to-peer systems, especially as we go into more hybrid-like experiences and more mixed reality experiences. And then, I brought up Neuralink, something like that, in really the far future, where you have a chip in your head and you're able to think thoughts to each other. Do you want your thoughts to be going through a server where somebody's farming them for data and serving you, again, more targeted ads? Or do you want those to be going through an encrypted tunnel with other people where you're thinking your thoughts directly to them and saving your thoughts directly in objects? That's basically what we're championing. And, I think it's important for people to at least be aware that there's basically server-based modes of communication and peer-to-peer encrypted modes of communication. I'm hopeful that as we go into an internet that is more interactive, more real-time, more synchronous, more immersive, and more invasive, that we will keep in mind that not everything should be going through a server that's owned by a big tech company, and that there is a very strong place, maybe even, the primary protocol should be peer-to-peer systems.
Right. And you guys have already started seeing that with education and other industries looking for that. That's really interesting. What have you learned by building this in public? I mean, you guys have really built this in public, and I think that's also unique.
Yeah, so many learnings from building in public. I think one of the interesting ones that's kind of a hybrid of what we were just talking about and an answer to this question is that you often have a hypothesis around why something is valuable, and sometimes it turns out that it is valuable, but it's for a completely different reason than you really thought. Right. And so, we had and still have a lot of ideology, I would say, and ideals, right? So this, even where I was just talking about the future of the internet, the need for peer-to-peer encryption, for, not sending all your data through a server, sure, that's an ideal, right? But it turns out that really what people, especially in education, are interested in is the fact that it scales at no cost. And so that was sort of like secondary hypothesis. Primary was privacy. Turns out people don't care that much, or they don't care as much as we thought about privacy. They really care about cost, right? And so This is basically how building a public has been for us since day one. We had our first event 3 weeks or 4 weeks after the first line of code, and we had a lot of hypothesis. We're building product during the week. It was really important to have events on a weekly basis so that we could test our hypothesis of a system we just built, and then rapidly change it. And, we did that first virtual Burning Man 4 months after our first line of code, and it was a mad scramble to build things. But we'd never had an event with tens of thousands of people in it until that first Burning Man. And we learned a ton during that. We were changing things, even every day, every night we were scrambling to improve things. So I think it's really critical to build in public. A lot of folks are afraid that somebody's going to steal their idea if they try to launch too early, or if they build publicly, or if they tell everybody what they're doing. The reality is, once you have any modicum of success, everybody's going to chase after that anyways.
Right,
so,
right.
I think the fear of building in public is a little bit overblown, and the benefit of building in public is probably understated.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's really interesting around, I do a lot of work with capital efficiency, helping, venture firms get more money back, right? Get their money back to their investors. And I think it really comes around all these teams being really efficient with their capital. And how I like to look at it is kind of 3 focal points, right? You have like your long-term vision. I think it should be somewhat tangible. So I like to think 3 years out. And then you have your end of the year vision, what success look like. And then you're kind of building, and then always in that 90 days, like, what do we need to do? How are we going to do it? Right. Having those 3 like focal pieces, I think is really important to balance what you're doing and what you need to do, and make sure, most importantly, that we're all in alignment. So all the work that we're doing equates to something, right? All the work that we're doing ends up being something. We're not wasting the capital, not wasting time, and especially not wasting energy, because people get burnt out, right? How have you balanced that? Because you've really like tripled down on technology. How have you been balancing that build?
Yeah, I think for us, it's funny. The 90-day thing that you mentioned is really critical. And, we look at the Venn diagram of what do our different customer groups need? What do they say they need? Can we pull out, other needs that might actually be more of needs than what we're hearing? And then what is the intersection between these different needs where we can build something that is useful to different customer groups? And that's something that's pretty important to us in that we like to build, you talk about technology focus we like to build flexible systems that can be used in a lot of different ways. And so the Venn diagram methodology of product building is very useful for that. Because if it's useful to one customer, that's probably that's fine. That's great. But if it's useful to 3 different customers and you can design the system in a way that's useful to 3 or more, then you are building something that's useful to multiple folks. And so we look at that in the 90-day schema all the time. We're constantly reevaluating what are our priorities, shifting things around. We have OKRs, so we're trying to drive more interactions, more social experiences. Does this system deliver on that or not? Over the multi-year, over the longer term for us, it's really about helping social experience creators have superpowers. And so building the tools and the systems that allow anybody to create hyper scalable, really interactive social experiences online, synchronous social experiences. In the short run, that's less critical for us because we have a lot of enterprise customers where we're crafting some of these experiences, right? So it's sort of, as you're thinking about the different time horizons, in the short term, you don't need to build things that scale necessarily. You need to build things that deliver value and drive usage and adoption and delight and joy. And, for us, a sense of belonging and interactions. That's our immediate term goal. But in the long term, it's about building tools and technologies that allows for scale and allows for others to do the kinds of things that you're doing right now somewhat manually and do that in a scalable way. And so that's kind of how we think about the different time frames.
Yeah. When we've talked in the past, what resonates with me that I think you guys are very good at doing, and I think you've built it into your cadence, is just this learning and acting. And that cycle of constantly learning and putting it to use. And what do you do within the organization that is disseminating that knowledge and that learning to act on it? And again, you guys are basically product and engineering, right now, and you're putting out products and have customers, but you don't have people out selling. So you're obviously learning quickly and deploying quickly. What's that look like for you guys?
Yeah, so most of our major customers have come inbound. We're now starting to, we're going to conferences in industries where we have customers, trying to build more breadth and not necessarily scale, right? Because you don't need to scale. You just need to find a core group of customers in an industry where you can have that Venn diagram. But we do a lot of, we talk to our customers a lot. It's convenient that our platform is a communication technology. And so it's actually quite fun to go and experiment and play around in the worlds with our customers. We're building templates with them. We're building different scenes, which are what we call, so you basically have a world design. You have templates that you can port across the worlds, and then scenes are a collection of assets or a specific experience that might be happening within the world. And so we're constantly working on those. We're building them. We have an SDK and an API. We have a team dedicated to building SDK and API applications. So we talk to our customers around that. We're constantly trying to learn and bring that into our actual product development. One of the reasons we actually built the SDK is so that we could experiment with things with our customers, right? So we can rapidly prototype and rapidly experiment with the SDK applications. Anything that's really valuable that we see ourselves doing over and over again, or that we need to do to the core product in order to evolve it, it usually starts as an SDK experiment, and then it slowly evolves into a core product evolution. And that way we can actually get a lot of feedback from our customers and with our customers and with their end users, right? Because we're really B2B to C in most cases. And so what are the consumers, what are the end users doing, what delights them, what do our customers themselves think, and then looking at the data, seeing what's happening with the SDK applications, and then that informs what we're building into the core product.
That's awesome. That's really awesome. All right. Well, I do have one last question, and I feel like I'm just drilling you with questions.
No, it's great.
You're just taking it.
Go for it.
Do you have any questions for me? No, you don't have to ask me a question, but go ahead if you do, if you want to.
Yeah, I guess the how, maybe for people that are listening, right? What is your top advice typically? Like, what kind of advice do you see yourself giving over and over again to venture-backed companies on how they should deploy capital to reach a 3-year goal?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it is the thing that probably keeps coming back, and it's probably the thing that I talk about most. And I'd say that a lot of advice to founders and CEOs in these teams is focus, 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 focus. But nobody tells you how to do that, right? Right? Like, even if you went to school, you're told to focus, or your parents tell you to focus, but no one ever really teaches you how to focus. And I see it even sitting in with teams, trying to get them focused for a couple hours around some of the work that we do. People are on their phones or jumping around, but before you can have focus, and I think this is one of the most important things, is that you have to have alignment, right? So your team needs to really understand where they're going and frame up some sort of destination. You start with your mission, your North Star, the cause, purpose, or belief, why you're going that direction in the first place. And then I like to create some tangible, like, again, 3-year vision, 1-year plan at the end of the year, 90 days, and have some focal points on that. So if that's not clear to the team, and if the team's not part of building that and buying into that, then basically your team's going in a bunch of different directions. And so if this was a hike and we wanted to get to the top of the peak, which is the 1-year plan, and we're going a bunch of different directions, we're obviously wasting a bunch of energy, time, and money, right? And so I think one of the biggest things is to get a team focused, to get them very aligned around the 3, around the 1, around the 90, and have that very clear. And if someone doesn't buy into that, at least they need to buy in and commit. If they don't buy into it, then they need to leave, But I think that's probably one of the most important things, because there's tens of hundreds of millions of dollars that are wasted in venture capital because the team's not aligned. And getting the team aligned and keeping them aligned, that's why you meet every 90 days and meet every week as a leadership team. Keeping them aligned is really important, because things are going to change.
Yep. Well, and Jeff, I'm curious how you've obviously been doing this and thinking about this problem space for a really long time. How has that changed in the last 2 years as venture capital has dried up a bit? It's harder for early stage companies to raise,
Right.
raise like a B round or an A round. How has your advice changed in the last couple of years?
Well, one, it's just even more prevalent. It's even more important, right? There's less money. There's less room for error. People could have a lot of money and waste a lot of money in the past, and that was okay. And I just think that now it's tighter. And I, unfortunately, I've been around a long time. I've seen this happen a couple other times. I started my career in the .com boom, so I watched that bust, and I watched this happen, all the way back then. But it's just, the reality is that we should always be super efficient with the capital that we have. And basically capital comes in, and our job is to create growth. And then it allows us to get more capital, to create more growth, and we continue to do that until we find an exit. And I think that's the simple name of the game. So we have to be very efficient with that capital. And even teams that are doing really well, right? Even the teams that are doing really well, the more they're efficient with that capital, that means more gains for them personally, more gains for their investors, right? So even when teams are doing well, but we see a lot of teams struggle, it's venture, right? So a lot of teams, all teams are doing things that have never been done before. Otherwise, they wouldn't have venture capital. But we need to be really efficient with that capital. We need to create that alignment. We need to create that focus. In the last 2 years, it's just become even more important. And the other thing that's changed in the last few years is that we've realized that we can work virtually, right? So the pandemic came, we had to work virtually. And then we realized, wow, we actually can do this. And one of my assumptions all along, because I've also been in the talent game, is that I've always thought it's better to work virtually because we can find really the right people that we need, versus trying to get everyone around Sacramento or where we are in LA, or, the reality is there's really good talent and you can, open up the net and find that talent. But now the issue is that we're not together. We're not talking about the issues all the time. Things are not as clear because we're, working from home. And even if the majority of our team's together, some people aren't. So I think having that cadence of getting the team together every 90 days and talking about what works, what doesn't work, double down on what doesn't work to make it into opportunities and to make it work. And then having that weekly meeting where we're talking about, keeping ourselves on focus, I think is really important, because these teams are just not together. They're not communicating like they used to. And so I think those are probably the two main things over the last couple of years that have been different and made it probably more important. Have you seen that with your team?
Definitely. And, I will say in the VC world, everybody's talking about capital efficiency and capital efficiency metrics.
Right.
And so that's, it's basically the question of how much incremental revenue can you generate with the resources that you have, or how many dollars does it cost to generate additional dollars of revenue. And that's very different than the paradigm in 2021 and before, which was basically how much growth can you have, hard stop, right?
Right.
Now it's really about the ratio between growth and how much money you're actually spending to grow, which is probably healthier. What I've heard is that's how it has been between the .com era and basically 2020. That's how most things were. It's about capital efficiency, and so
right.
I think we've returned to that time, to normal times, basically.
And the low hanging fruit is just consistency, right? Like a lot of people join venture backed companies because we're doing new and innovative things, and there's creativity involved. But the reality is, the more consistent you can be with your team, making sure that you have those meetings, that you're talking about the things that are not working, making plans, iterating on them, learning from them, like you guys have been doing. I think that iteration, that cycle is so important, and that consistency actually is freeing, allows you to create faster and create more, and that really reduces that loss of capital. And you guys have done it with your product, you've done it with clients, so I think you guys definitely have keyed in on that and found that opportunity. But I think that's the lowest hanging fruit, is this consistency. And a lot of people love chaos or think startups are chaos, but the reality is the ones that are most consistent are time and time again are the ones that win.
Well, it's interesting. You're saying consistent. Another word for that, I think, is process, right?
Right.
And so there's always this trade-off between process and chaos, essentially.
Right.
And sometimes, when you're trying to figure out product market fit, and in general, like the Y Combinator mentality, do things that don't scale, right? Yeah. That's basically don't have process, do things manually. But there is this balancing act between things that don't scale and doing things manually, and just energy and effort that you're putting in versus process. And the reality is, the later stage you go, and the more you want to, if you want to raise a Series B, you need to have process, right? You need to have consistency. And so what works early on does not work later on.
There's going to be some things that you're going to do that are not scalable in the early days, and you should. But if you think about even the earliest of days, defining your product and product market fit, it's the scientific method, right? Like, you are a scientist trying to figure this out, and that's a process. There's a process to figure out your sales cycle or your sales message. You know what I mean? So everything underlying is a process to learn and attempt something new and learn again. So I think that happens in every functional area of the business and continues to happen. It's just that as you get to A, as you get to B, C, D, and later stages, you've dialed it in much more. But I really would disagree with anyone that says there's no process in the beginning. You wake up and you work through a day. That's a process. But there are things that don't scale. Like, there are things that you do in the beginning that don't scale, and that might be doing one-on-ones with your team on a weekly basis, and later it's every other week, and later it's once a week, you know? And then there's things that you should always do, like meet with your leadership team once a week. You know what I mean? So yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. I mean, even specific areas of the business, right? Not reinventing the wheel and figuring out what is the process that works that others have done. You know, I tend to think that when you're trying to create a company, like you need to be really innovative in one area, maybe, or two areas. But if you try to innovate across the entire thing and start from scratch everywhere, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Right. And so using other people's process as much as you can, and implementing process wherever you can. And then there are going to be some areas where you can't have or it's not going to be fully built out. When you're inventing a product, for example, there is going to be process around it, but there's certain aspects of that innovation that maybe are going to be less process oriented. But generally, the more process you can have, the more efficient it is, the more you can actually, especially as you grow the number of people that are involved, without consistency, without process, without an understanding of the objectives and the mission, as you pointed out earlier, then it's really hard for people to make decisions on their own or to actually move the ball forward on their own.
Yeah.
And so, it's a balancing act for sure.
It is a balancing act. And I think the thing about processes is don't let the process get in the way of doing the right thing, and question the process, because that's actually part of the process. And I think that's really important.
Love that.
You know, so I see some people, you know, stick to it, and that's why you see the later stage companies will say, well, that's because that's how we've always done it, right? But you have to always keep inventing, always keep questioning. But I do think process is really important. I've just seen it. I've seen billions of dollars go into these companies that I've worked with, and I've seen billions of dollars go out. And it's the ones that define the process, or at least put the stake in the ground at different stages to really be able to iterate from that actually find the end of the light at the end of the tunnel, right? The ones that really start to figure it out. So, I think process is important, but you do have to question the process from time to time to make sure that you're doing the right thing. Well, awesome,
Great.
Man. Thanks so much for joining me. I do have one last question for you, and this is the most important question on the show. And I know I hit you with a lot of questions, but this might actually be the most important question I've ever asked anyone. And so it might be the most important question that you've ever heard. But here's the scenario. You are on a desert island, and you're there for the rest of your life. No going back. It's a tropical desert island, so it's nice. You're not going to burn out in the sun. You have plenty of food and water, and so you're set. But what you don't have is a lot of entertainment. However, you found an old 80s boombox that washed up on the shore, and it has endless batteries. But you only get to choose. You only get to choose one album to listen to the rest of your life. What album is that?
I'd go with Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd.
No hesitation.
Yeah. That's what I'd go with.
That's an awesome answer. That's an awesome.
Thank you.
How long have you been listening to Pink Floyd?
I was introduced to Pink Floyd by an uncle when I was 16 in a car trip. He gave me, it was a Walkman. He gave me headphones, and it completely blew my mind.
Oh, wow.
And I think every time I listen to Pink Floyd, it never gets old, right?
Yeah.
So if I was going to listen to the same album, and Dark Side of the Moon in particular was built to be listened to from the beginning to the end, which I'm taking into account as an answer to this question, because I'm going to listen to the album from beginning to end over and over and over again. And, it never gets old, and it was constructed for that kind of listening environment. And I think I would enjoy it more than any other record in that way.
That's awesome. That's a great answer. I love that. I saw Pink Floyd in the 90s, mid 90s.
Whoa.
And I think we're Soldier Field, Chicago. Yeah.
I'm going to see Rolling Stones at Soldier Field next week, actually, with my CTO. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. All right. Well, let me know how the show goes. Thanks again for joining me on this show. And it was a pleasure having you.
Thanks for having me. This is great.